Mike. And hello to everyone, and thank you for coming today and allowing me to share some information with you, but really to share myself, because the Amos Beman scrapbooks are closely connected to the Dixwell Congregational Church, which is obviously, yes, a spiritual house of worship, but from another standpoint, it is the pivotal African-American institution historically in the city of New Haven and much really throughout the state of Connecticut. And so the Dixwell Congregational Church, which was originally the Temple Street Congregational Church, formed and shaped the people who raised me, the community that I come from, and so it obviously helped shape and raise me. And Mr. Mike, I appreciate you talking about my mom, and it actually really ties into what the story of the Amos Beman scrapbooks tell. They tell obviously about Amos Beman, who we'll get into a bit further into the discussion, but it documents the history of people who have made an impact and literally built this nation. And oftentimes African Americans are overlooked in formal history and definitely in documented history. So the Amos Beman scrapbooks provide us with a look of what life was like for 19th century African Americans, what it took to build many of the institutions and the communities that, you know, sustain and have allowed us to be here today. I want to talk a bit about the Temple Street Congregational Church, founded in 1820 as the African Ecclesiastical Society. The society was a group of African-American leaders who wanted to use their time and their individual talents to really create a true community for the Black inhabitants of New Haven at the time. During the time of the creation of the AES, African Americans had poor housing, they had no access to real employment, and obviously I'm talking about free people because in Connecticut at the time, slavery was still legal in the state. And so really Black citizens were here and just fending for themselves. And so obviously there were people who were intelligent and who were hardworking and who had, who felt that they had the right to have the American dream because they helped to build the American dream. They helped to build the country. In the case of Amos Beman, Amos Beman's grandfather, Caesar, was a veteran of the Revolutionary War. He fought in the war in place of his master. And that experience, I'm sure, shaped the way that he raised his children and the things that he taught them about what they had the right to and what they had earned, and what stake that they could have out of this new young nation. And so Caesar by trade was a cobbler, and he taught his son Jehiel the trade of shoemaking. And Jehiel also was, you know, called to minister, to be a minister of the gospel. And so he was a preacher, and he was a founder of the Cross Street African Methodist Episcopal Church in Middletown. And he used, I'm sure, the knowledge of the men from the generation before him to empower African Americans in Middletown and throughout the state, and to create a community in Middletown around the church for decent housing and an upright, livable society for African Americans there. And Jehiel passed those same beliefs and tenets on to his son Amos, who, interestingly enough, was taught the beginning of his, academics by African-American teachers, one woman who ran a private school, and then a well-known man who tutored and taught students. And so he built on his early education from Black teachers at the Oneida Institute, where he was able to have access to higher formal education. And endowed with that rare opportunity for formal education as an African American, he matched what he learned there with the greater calling to make a difference in the world and serve his people. And so Amos Beman became a teacher and a minister himself. And he ended up in New Haven at the Temple Street Congregational Church. Now, the Congregational Church was originally the African Ecclesiastical Society. African American men joined with a very special and rare individual by the name of Simeon Jocelyn, who was originally an engraver and a clockmaker. And he also felt that he had a spiritual calling to help the African American population, definitely in terms of establishing themselves as a community, but to instruct them in moral and spiritual ways. And so Simeon Jocelyn and these African American leaders from New Haven got together, and from that association came a few years of obviously instruction and meeting, and in the growth, it became the Temple Street Congregational Church. This church was New Haven's first recognized Black church. There is a history of the Varick AME Church being founded earlier, but that was primarily an African American undertaking, and so, historically was not paid much attention to. But the Temple Street Church was nurtured and developed by the Congregational Church, like the First Congregational Church, also known as Center Church, and the other congregational churches took Temple Street on as a younger sibling and helped to guide and develop the congregation. But out of that church, you have leading members of New Haven's early African American community. And if I share some of the names with you, these are names that you'll be able to go back through and connect to in other stories. For instance, you have people like John Creed, who was the father of Yale's first African-American medical school graduate, Cortland Creed. You have William Boucher, the father of Edward Boucher, Yale's first undergraduate Black graduate, and he was the first African-American to earn a PhD in the United States. And so from these people who had come here as slaves and servants, you have this spark that pushes them to teach and to foster this development in their children to be as great as they possibly could be. And with the arrival of Amos Beman in New Haven at Temple Street in 1841, the trajectory was straight up. He bought his own belief that in order to be a good society, you must be a sober society. So Amos Beman was an active leader in the temperance movement of, getting people to not imbibe in alcoholic beverages. And he felt it was necessary for the African American community to be focused and to be not distracted, so that the development as a total people can happen quicker. And so the African Americans out of Temple Street not only were leaders amongst the temperance movement for Blacks, they were for the state in general. As that movement became unpopular, the Blacks out of Temple Street were still pushing for the, teetotaling, if you will. Amos Beman also conducted a way station for the Underground Railroad. There are stories, for instance, in the story around William Lanson of African Americans who had fled slavery in the South, receiving their first spiritual instruction inside of Temple Street Church from Amos Beman, and them being sent on their way to the next stop. That was dangerous work. You obviously could go to jail, but you could lose your life for it. New Haven had suffered all kinds of upheaval around the issue of slavery and the abolitionists. And so for Amos Beman to take on the responsibility to not only espouse helping people free themselves and to stop the institution of slavery, he participated actively in making sure that people were free. And so he didn't just spread these sentiments, he lived them. And for a long time, he was really the heart and soul of the Black community here. Unfortunately, due to economic circumstances, he had a very hard time while he was at Temple Street being paid for his work. And there were some years that he didn't get paid at all. And he still moved through with working and dedicating himself to the church and to the work of the people throughout the state. And his work made it possible for larger stories like the Amistad Case to progress in the way that it did. You know, people think that African Americans were sort of backdrop and filler to many of the instances and situations that happened historically in our nation. And they weren't just background noise. They weren't standing and watching. They weren't waiting as things happened to and for them. They were active participants. These were men who worked side by side with the top legal minds at the time, Yale graduates, city officials, national figures. Most of these men were largely uneducated, but they were active participants in the development of not only the race and the community here, but honestly in the development of the United States of America. The Temple Street Church is enjoying its 200th year in existence this year in 2020. Many of the celebrations were dampened by COVID, but we are still celebrating in ways with partners like the Beinecke Library, who always remembers us fondly and looks for opportunities to share the story, because the story of Temple Street, the story of Amos Beman and the Beman family, is the story of New Haven. It's the story of a lot of the happenings for civil rights and human rights in Connecticut and in the United States. And if you think about it, Amos Beman being in New Haven when he was, is also the story of a transatlantic relationship between the Mende mission in Sierra Leone, Africa, where the captives of the Amistad originally came from, Europe and the United States. And that relationship existed a long time through the Congregational Church at large, and definitely in the life of the Temple Street and Dixwell Congregational Church. If you take the time to go through the collection, you will see stories, articles, photographs, classed rosters. There's a letter from Frederick Douglass to Amos Beman. I think it's one of the most moving parts of the collection to me, knowing that I have a direct connection to someone who had a direct connection to a luminary like Frederick Douglass. But in this letter, Frederick Douglass is giving Amos Beman advice, personal advice. And Mr. Mike and I were talking about the awesome view that we can get to see the kind of relationship that these individuals have. We think about them as great historical figures, but not as people. what makes them tick, what makes them operate, and what it was like behind a lot of the work that they did and the sacrifices that they made. Amos Beman was very active in journalism. He was a contributor to William Lloyd Garrison's newspaper. He was a contributor to Frederick Douglass's North Star newspaper. And you'll see clips of all of these things throughout the books. They come in many volumes of the total collection. And so you should take the time to go through, and you should take the time to really feel the connection. These books came to the Beinecke Library from the Dixwell Congregational Church. And I think one of the most meaningful things is that these folks over from 1820 to the 1970s, when the Dixwell Church actually shared the collection with Beinecke, held on to these materials. The ledgers, the scrapbooks of Amos Beman were part of the soul of the church. And not only the soul of the church, but the soul of the people here in New Haven. Out of the Temple Street Church, out of the direct influence of Amos Beman and Amos Beman's dad and his grandfather and all those men who we don't know by name, who contributed to a person like an Amos Beman, made a direct impact on what African Americans are doing today. You have many of Yale's firsts in various fields, first African Americans coming out of Temple Street Church. You have Yale Law School graduates like George Crawford. You have people like W.E.B. Du Bois, whose grandfather lived in New Haven at the same time that Amos Beman was here. You have people like John Daniels, New Haven's first African-American mayor. You have people like Charles McGlynn, who was the first African-American elected to New Haven City Council. All of these people are coming out of Temple Street / Dixwell Congregational Church. And it wasn't a fluke and it wasn't a mistake. Part of the spiritual work and a part of the guidance that was taking place out of that building was not just in teaching people how to pray and to connect to God and sing hymns. It was teaching people how to activize and activate their that spiritual duty. A part of the mission of being a good Congregationalist, a good Temple Street Dixwell member, was to get out into the community and make a difference. And so because of legal discrimination, African Americans were relegated to using the church for all of their needs. And so the Temple Street Church became a place where there were classes on how to be a good mother, classes on how to learn the basics of reading, what you should do in order to make sure your child is properly educated. There was a men's speaker series. There were traveling luminaries who were always speaking from the pulpit. So Amos Beman was a central cog in the wheel that developed a hungry and vital community that wanted to make a difference. And we are, those of us alive now, are direct beneficiaries of Amos Beman's work. You can look now even at State Representative Tony Walker, who was the daughter of one of the ministers of the Temple Street Church. A lot of what I get in terms of personal interest comes from the influence of the Reverend Dr. Edwin R. Edmonds, who was a longtime pastor of Dixwell Church. And beyond, being the pastor, he was a visionary and an intellectual whiz who always encouraged people to learn and to pursue academic interests. I know for a fact that the Beman collection and the other early works that we have made a direct impact on him. And so him pushing me directly and pushing his daughter, you know, gives us people who are sitting in the legislature today. So you don't look at these people's lives in separate instances. You look at them in totality and the way that they're connected and the way that we're connected. And the building of individual people like Caesar did for his son and like Jehiel did for Amos was also the building of a community. And while you all are home and not able to access libraries fully, take the time to peruse what Beinecke has. The collections relating to African Americans are awesome. James Weldon Johnson, Carl Van Vechten's works that are inside of the Beinecke Library, and the Amos Beman collection. Take time to learn and to open your minds, and it'll give you a fresh perspective. And I think that's what this COVID timeout has done for all of us. It's given us the ability and the time to reset. And I've looked through the collection many times before having to participate in sharing with you today, but I refreshed myself with the collection, and every time I look through the collection, I get something new. I recently was doing work on the life of William Lansing, and you know, scholars tend to think like, oh, we've exhausted all the information, all the repositories we can to find information on a William Lansing. Well, inside the Beman collection, you have personal information on Lansing family members from Amos Beman. And the care and the time that he took says to me that he had insight and foresight to document all the work that he was doing, but also to speak for the other people around him who are making contributions. And so we should honor that spirit and take time to learn and take a walk through the Amos Beman collection. Thank you.